Welcome. Today, in anticipation of the UN Climate Summit and mass protests planned for New York in late September, we devote the hour to climate change and current efforts to curtail it. Environmental activist and Gandhi Peace Award winner Bill McKibben will join us. We'll also meet people from the movement to divest fossil fuel stocks, which is growing at colleges, churches, and cities. Then we'll look at the climate data that has top business leaders from both parties linking arms against a sea of trouble. From the first energy czar of New York, we'll learn about the state's plan for decentralized power generation. And later, through the smog, we'll try to get a clear picture of Beijing's complex anti-pollution politics. First, a conversation with Bill McKibben. Arguably the leading environmentalist in the country, he warned us about climate change 25 years ago in the book The End of Nature. About a dozen books later, he's now a distinguished scholar at Middlebury College and leads the anti-carbon group 350.org. Welcome, so nice to have you in our studio.
Always good to be with you, Brian.
And first, give us a preview of what we can expect through September in New York.
September 21st will be the biggest single day in the climate movement's history. There'll be hundreds of thousands of people.
The biggest day in the movement's history.
Yes, there's, you know, and this is actually, I mean, it's an interesting way to think about this. There shouldn't really have to be a movement if you think about it. I mean, 25 years ago, scientists told us that the worst thing that ever happened in the world was in the process of happening. And they more or less told us what to do about it. You know, ramp up the transition to renewable energy, put a price on carbon, on and on. In a rational world, that would have been warning enough. You know, if our world worked the way it should, we would have proceeded. Instead, in this country and in many others, we've had basically a 25-year bipartisan effort to accomplish nothing, and it's been entirely successful. At a certain point, a few years ago, some of us finally wised up to the fact that our reasoning wasn't getting the job done. We'd won the argument, we'd just lost the fight.
So the biggest day in the anti-global warming movement's history. That's right. A massive demonstration in New York?
A big march through the streets of New York in preparation for this UN climate summit that will happen a few days later. Ban Ki-moon has summoned world leaders to New York to talk about climate. We're sadly unconvinced that world leaders left to their own devices will do any more than they've done in the past, so the world citizens are coming to New York as they have in the past.
Do street protests and street marches work anymore? I'm thinking back to the February before the Iraq War in 2003, massive outpouring of humanity in the streets of New York. Didn't work.
Did not work. Well, think back a little farther. Think back to the last great gathering in New York on Sheep's Meadow, I think, around the nuclear freeze in the early 1980s. Hundreds of thousands of people. That did change the flavor of politics, enough so that 2 or 3 years later it was Ronald Reagan, of all people, that was proposing abolishing the things when he met with Mikhail Gorbachev in Reykjavik. They don't always work, but there is, just as there are physical tipping points around the climate, there is a political tipping point that we're getting near, I think.
And so, who are the targets of that demonstration? Because it immediately precedes the climate summit, is it less the corporations and more the world political leaders?
There's plenty to go around. But the point of one of the points of the march, I think, is going to be that we're tired of words. I think we may try to do it without the usual big speeches because we've heard a lot of words over the years. Time now for deeds, for action. And
what does that mean? Civil disobedience?
No. Time for action from our leaders. In this case, I don't think there'll be civil disobedience in New York. Although we've done that on a large scale elsewhere around the country and around the world. But what we do need from our leaders in nations around the planet is serious commitment ahead of the next UN climate talks, which will be in Paris in 2015. You'll recall Copenhagen in 2009. That was when, if Hollywood had been writing the ending to this story, you know, we would all have come together and risen up and done the right thing.
Total bust.
The biggest foreign policy failure since Munich, you know. We can't have that again in Paris. If we're going to have anything else, then we need leadership soon from the US, from China. We also need leadership from Wall Street. And that's starting to happen. This powerful divestment movement is beginning to change minds down there. People are actually starting to understand that we have to keep most of the coal and gas and oil that we know about underground. So that tipping point's coming, but we've got to accelerate it.
And as I think you know, we're going to be talking about that divestment movement specifically with our next guest. So the timeline is demonstrations and then summit in New York in September, conference toward a possible treaty in Paris next year.
That's right.
Why think it'll be any different than Copenhagen?
I think the only difference is that in the years since Copenhagen, this movement has emerged all over the world. I mean, just the one group that I helped found, 350.org, has organized now about 20,000 rallies in every country on earth except North Korea. There is a global demand for action. That's one reason. The second reason is we're running out of excuses not to. It's becoming very clear that our technology is capable of this change. There were days this summer when the Germans generated 75% of the power they used from solar panels within their borders. Germany, not Florida, not Texas, not California, Germany. That doesn't mean we've solved all the problems with renewable energy. We have to do a lot of work on grids and storage and things like that. But, you know, if arguably the most successful economy in the world can figure out how to do this, then the rest of us can too. Third reason, the Earth is sending us the strongest possible signals that it's time to act, even for those of us who've worried about these things a long time.
Like something we call in New York, Sandy?
Sandy was a good one. A much stronger kick in the gut came this spring when scientists said the West Antarctic ice sheet, the great glaciers there have begun an irrevocable process of melt. It'll add 10 feet to our previous predictions of sea level rise. That was about as bad news as it was possible to get. And if that doesn't serve as a wake-up call, as an alarm, then nothing will.
But people don't respond to printed summaries of reports. People respond to kicks in the gut like Sandy. And I wonder if there have been enough in enough places to galvanize that kind of movement, to put pressure on political leaders.
You know, every place around the world now, almost every day, there's something record-setting going on. A record-setting drought, a record-setting flood. Place after 80% of American counties have had a federally declared disaster in the last 2 years. That's why the polling data shows a demand for action. You can tell the polling data is changing because politicians like President Obama are now starting to get involved in this fight. Mother Nature's doing her part to educate. It's the job of all of us to figure out how to kind of make that education count, tell, bring it home in time. We're no longer at the point where we can stop global warming. That's not one of the options on the menu. But we are, we hope, still narrowly at the point where we can keep it from getting worse than it absolutely has to get.
So what is policy change number one to you in the United States? Is it a carbon tax still?
If we could put a price on carbon, that would help enormously. And the smart scheme for this is fee and dividend is what we're talking about. You put a big tax and then you rebate the money to people directly, so you're made whole against the change. Economists have been saying that for 25 years. We also, at this point, need a kind of World War II sort of effort on infrastructure rollout. We got to build those solar panels and wind turbines with great speed. But none of that can happen, I think, until we've really broken the power of the fossil fuel industry. That's what's kept us from making change for 25 years. Hence, things like the divestment stuff that you'll be talking about are of extreme importance.
How do you break the back of the fossil fuel industry if people continue to consume at the rate that Americans consume?
Well, that makes it harder, and one of the things we need to be doing all the time is cutting down on our consumption. But we no longer think what we did, I think, 10 years ago, that the very key first action for people to take is to change their light bulb. By this point, a lot of people have changed their light bulbs, and they've figured out that that's not fixing the problem. The problem is structural and systemic. It's embedded in the price of carbon, it's embedded in regulatory structures, it's embedded in that political power of the fossil fuel industry. So the answer will be structural and systemic too. If you had one thing to do, it wouldn't be change your light bulb, it would be organize. Organize, organize. And if you have some time and energy left over, then by all means change your light bulb, because that's important too.
And yet it's also part of human nature to adapt to the new normal. So I think we see a lot more adaptation to global warming and maybe less talk about trying to prevent it, because even you say it's not preventable.
It's not.
Can we adapt our way out of this
So
crisis?
here's the math. I mean, it's relatively easy. We've raised the temperature 1 degree so far. If we do everything right, we'll be able to stop at about 2 degrees Celsius, global average temperature. There's enough momentum in the system, the temperature will keep going up.
So about 4
That's
degrees
terrible.
Fahrenheit, and people say, oh, 4 degrees,
Yeah.
what's 4 degrees?
1 degree has been enough to melt the Arctic and the Antarctic. Okay, 2 degrees will cause enormous trouble. We're on a path for 6 degrees Celsius at the moment, roughly 10 degrees Fahrenheit. If we do that, we can't have civilizations like the ones we're accustomed to having, not even close. You can't do agriculture of the kind we're used to doing in that scenario. This is by far the biggest thing that humans have ever done, by far. I mean, when people look back at our time on Earth, the thing that will mark us is that we were alive when the planet left the Holocene and moved into some other phase. And that's a scary place to be, but it is a place that confers great responsibility on us to, you know, if nothing else, be out in the street on the 21st of September.
Your organization, 350.org, what does the number represent?
That's the most important number in the world, though we didn't know it until 5 or 6 years ago. Our greatest climate scientist, Jim Hansen, who worked up on the Upper West Side, he and his team at NASA put out a study saying the most carbon you could safely have in the atmosphere is 350 parts per million CO2. Anything above that, they said, was not compatible with the planet on which human civilization developed and to which life on Earth is adapted. The last 3 months, the planet's been at 400 parts per million, the first time in at least 800,000 years that it's been that high. And we increase 2 parts per million per year. We are too high already. We are going higher. That's why this struggle has gotten so desperate.
Before you go, tell us one more time what to either watch for or participate in late September.
September 21st, no watching. This is one of the ones where attendance is compulsory. In the streets of New York, we're going to show the world that the time has actually come to change.
Do you have permits? Talking to the de Blasio administration? Do you know where you're going to be?
So far, so good. Someplace down the spine of Manhattan, not only the greatest city in the world, but the most global, and a city that learned from Sandy that there's no amount of wealth and power that can insulate us from what's coming.
Bill McKibben, thank you very much.
Thank you.
In addition to the street demonstrations being organized, another kind of protest against climate change is growing. It echoes the anti-apartheid movement of the 1980s, divestment. Hundreds of campaigns around the world have called on universities, religious institutions, and governments to remove fossil fuel-related stocks from their portfolios. About a dozen colleges and 25 cities, including San Francisco, have already divested. Joining us are two leaders of this new chapter of climate protest. Serene Jones is president of the Union Theological Seminary in Manhattan. She wrote a piece in Time last month announcing the seminary would divest from fossil fuels. And on Skype, Kate Aronoff, a newly graduated alumni of Swarthmore College, where there's an ongoing effort to get that small but wealthy school in suburban Philadelphia to divest the carbon-burning part of its $1.6 billion endowment. Welcome to both of you.
Thanks so much for having me on, Brian.
Serene Jones, tell us, what did the Union Theological Seminary do, and why did you do it?
Yeah, well, 3 weeks ago, our board, 24 people, made a unanimous decision to divest our endowment. It's about $108 million. It's a small endowment. We're a small school, of fossil fuel investments. And it was a long process of careful consideration. Our investment committee, we manage our own investment, looked carefully at it, considered it from all different angles. At a very practical level, we found that portfolios similar to ours that had not been invested in fossil fuels performed on average 0.6% worse. And we thought, well, if that is to be, you know, our lot, then it's a small price to pay. But it was primarily religious reasons that led us to do this.
Religious?
Yes, religious.
Because?
In the mission of our school, we state very clearly that we are dedicated to training men and women for ministry in church and society, and that the care of the earth is a part of that mission. And that comes from our deep Christian roots, grounded in a vision that this earth is God's creation, it's a gift to humanity, and that it is not ours to destroy, and that is what we're doing.
Before we bring in Kate, in Philadelphia, what are some of the stocks that you held that you'll be selling? If we're divesting and we want people to know about divestment, what are you divesting from?
Well, it's very interesting because many of our investments are in mutual funds and are also in blended funds. So it's going to be a very complex process of working with our valued portfolio managers to show us, in fact, what we have in those funds.
It's the major oil companies, ExxonMobil, beyond that, what?
Yes, I think that's what we have to see. We are not even sure in terms of some of these investments what the extent of our involvement is.
So Kate, Swarthmore College, I think, has about 16 times the endowment of the Union Theological Seminary. What's happening there?
Something like that. So Swarthmore has a $1.6 billion endowment. So our campaign with Swarthmore Mountain Justice has been running for about 4 years. So we went down to visit folks resisting mountaintop removal coal mining in the fall of my freshman year. And talking to folks down there, came back and thought we needed to do something to act in solidarity with people who've been waging this fight since before most of us were even born. So we came back and had studied social movements and had studied kind of what had happened on college campuses in years past, and looked to fossil fuel divestment, and divestment as a tactic in general is something that had been used historically in solidarity with struggles for social, economic, and political rights.
And successfully, as you understand the history, because I could off the top of my head say this has worked to bring real change exactly once in the history of protest, and that was the anti-apartheid movement of the 80s. When else? Anything you would list?
That's right. I think there's a really rich history of shareholder engagement. There's a rich history of students really acting around their endowment. The Responsible Endowments Coalition, for instance, was formed when students at 5 universities who were making asks of their universities to think about how deep their commitments lie to things like social justice, and the Responsible Endowments Coalition, I think, has really coalesced around this idea that endowments are a really powerful source of change in society, and that colleges and universities, many of whom have really deep stated commitments to social justice, have a sort of natural clout in society to kind of say, we as institutions of higher learning think that we are really well positioned to say that fossil fuels aren't right, that apartheid...
If enough people do it. So can you name, Serene Jones, movements other than the anti-apartheid movement where divestment has actually brought change?
Yeah, no, I want to make 2 points about this. First of all, I think that the divestment of fossil fuels is probably more similar to the decisions that were made on the part of a number of religious communities and universities to shift their investments in tobacco. And that was done knowing that tobacco was dangerous, it was killing people, and in the long run it did not impact the tobacco industry. Tobacco just moved overseas and began selling cigarettes to children in other countries. It had a decisive shift in this country. But secondly, what was important to us is, even if you could come back tomorrow and tell me, Serene, your $110 million endowment or your $1.6 billion endowment is not going to make any difference. It's still important that we do it because we are contributing to the destruction of our earth. It's a moral claim. Now,
Kate, my understanding is you haven't gotten your school yet, even though this movement at the college and university level, I think, originated at Swarthmore. Swarthmore has not agreed to divest from fossil fuel producing companies, correct?
That's correct. And I think, like Serene was saying, I think the real weight of fossil fuel divestment is in the moral reproach it can provide. So with tobacco, while it's arguable that universities didn't financially nick out the company, I think the societal shift in how people think about tobacco is really evidence for the strength of movements around endowments. So while Swarthmore hasn't actually divested yet, I think there's been a real change in the national conversation around climate change that I think is sourced in part in the fossil fuel divestment movement of the last 2 years.
What does Swarthmore tell you about why they're not divesting?
There's a really similar sort of set of arguments that have been made at colleges from Swarthmore and similar institutions like Middlebury and Harvard. We hear a number of arguments. One is that it's just too complicated, that there aren't the financial mechanisms in place in order for the college to divest, and that it's really not in our hands. We hear that it's a slippery slope, that the college, if they divest from fossil fuels, it opens up the door to divesting from a whole host of other industries. And really, I think these have been really challenged in the past semester. BlackRock, the largest investment manager, the largest asset manager in the world, worked with the NRDC to create a fossil-free fund. So I think as the movement grows and as investors really start realizing that not only are these stocks morally reprehensible, they're bad investments. These are not investments that are going to bear fruit in the long term. So I think we're seeing a real sea change and a challenge to administrators' arguments that this isn't possible.
And Serene Jones, where do you draw the line on what to invest in, what to divest from? Fossil fuels aren't the only evil in the world. She mentions the slippery slope. Yeah. Does it make you think about being even more selective? And where do you draw that moral line for for money-producing investments?
I mean, the slippery slope argument is a good one, and in fact, to be a human being is to live on a slippery slope. If you buy the argument that if you do this, then you're going to have to do everything else, you would never act on anything. And just as an example of this, the very same meeting in which we decided to divest from fossil fuels, we asked the investment committee to begin the process of evaluating our investments in for-profit prisons. We were glad to start sliding down that slope because we think it's part of our responsibility as citizens of this country and as Christians and as people of good conscience.
I understand, Kate, that one of your fellow students wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal calling your campus movement radical. And I wonder how you reacted to that. It's not true, we're not radical, or badge of honor, you bet we're radical. What was your reaction to that piece?
Well, I think radical is always a contextual term. So in the 1950s, folks asking for basic human rights for African Americans in this country were considered radical. Before the Civil War, folks calling for abolition were radical. So I think radical is a term that evolves and changes over time, and we are asking for something that might be considered radical that I think is really more common sense. And what I think is radical is that universities are invested at all in these industries that are destroying communities and lives on our planet.
Are you worried, Serene, that the union community has kind of morally cleansed itself, but then it's too easy to sit back and not take the next steps? I don't know if you're going to be participating in the September 21st actions that we heard about from Bill McKibben or whatever. Maybe, okay, we've done our part, and it's too easy?
Oh, we see ourselves as so implicated at every level. The decision to divest was like a drop in the bucket of the things that we're committed to doing. Union, as an example of this, is hosting a 3-day conference before the UN, the 3 days preceding the big rally in New York. And the day of the rally, we're going to be hosting an interreligious service at the cathedral at 6 o'clock for all of the people from faith communities around the world who are concerned about the earth to get together. And there's so much more we have to do, including educating people about the basics of climate change and what it means for their future.
So what's next for you?
So what's next for us is to get ready for this climate change conference. And today what was next for us was figuring out what it means to be a Christian in the face of what I think is the travesty of the decision that Supreme Court made to support Hobby Lobby.
And what's next for you, Kate? Because you're gone from Swarthmore now, right?
I am. So I'm planning to be an active alumni in that campaign and also continue working with the Divestment Student Network over the summer to really create relationships among students who are working on divestment across the country and build what needs to be a grassroots movement, not only for divestment, but for climate justice.
Well, thank you both very much for talking with us.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
In the 1983 movie Risky Business, Tom Cruise accidentally drowns his dad's Porsche in Lake Michigan. In the new version of Risky Business, everyone's in deep water. But the sequel is not a movie. It's the name of a report recently released by a bipartisan group of top business leaders that warns inaction on climate change threatens the economy. Put another way, denial can lead to depression. A major player in the Risky Business project is Tom Steyer, a hedge fund billionaire and Democratic Party donor. But banker Henry Paulson, George Bush's Treasury Secretary, is part of the group too, along with Gregory Page, executive chairman of Cargill Incorporated, the agribusiness giant that donates money mostly to the GOP. Michael Bloomberg co-chairs the project with Paulson and Steyer, and this range of supporters reportedly signed on because they were assured the study would be conducted independently. The Risky Business Project director joins us. She is Kate Gordon, an expert in the intersection of clean energy and economic development, currently with Steyer's Next Gen company and a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. Kate Gordon joins us via Skype from San Francisco. Welcome to our program. Hello from New York.
Hi, Brian. It's great to be here.
So we hear report after report about climate change. How is your report different?
Well, we wanted to take a stand that was a little different in that we did not want to fall immediately into the sort of partisan hole of the fight over the science or the partisan hole of the fight over the specific policy solution. We took a classic business risk assessment approach and essentially said, look, any other issue that had this kind of certainty that it's going to be a problem, we would do a risk assessment to figure out what kind of risks it actually poses to American business. So that's what we set out to do.
So give me a good example of this risk assessment.
Sure. So we did sort of what businesses do a lot, which is that we looked out in a very granular way. So we looked at even at the county level throughout the United States at, for instance, what kinds of heat impacts we can expect to see over the course of the century. And then we looked at the economic impacts of those heat impacts. So as an example, let's say you're looking at a county or a state in the southeast part of the United States, and you're looking at the number of days above 95 degrees that you can expect to see over the course of this century. By mid-century and by the end of the century, those days over 95 degrees translate into very specific economic impacts, whether it's increased demand for air conditioning, which raises energy prices. Extreme heat actually makes power plants less effective, so you have to run them more. It leads to labor productivity losses. It leads to heat-related mortality, and it leads to all kinds of issues with grain yield declines, for instance, for the agricultural sector. So we basically said, let's look at the impact from climate change that scientists are fairly certain of. Let's look at the median outcomes, the most likely outcomes for particular parts of the US, and then let's look at the tail risks, the 1 in 20, the 1 in 100 potential outcomes.
I want to put on our screen the map that came as one of the graphics in your report showing the likely impacts on different parts of the country. Viewers, if you click on any of those, when you're on the site of this report, riskybusiness.org, you'll see different things. For example, in the southeast there, the risk is the heat, as we were just talking about. In the northeast, our part of the country, it's sea level rise, things like Sandy. And in the northwest, it's trees burning. In the southwest, it's also heat, and of course, it's already so hot in Arizona and places like that. West Coast, sea level rise and heat, Great Plains, the breadbasket agriculture shifts that react to the heat in the south, floods and heat, Alaska melting, we've all heard about the ice melting in Alaska, and then sea level rise out in Hawaii. So we talked about the southeast a little bit. You want to pick one of the others, maybe our region where we're doing the show from, the northeast?
Sure, absolutely. Well, as you all know from Hurricane Sandy, the issue in the Northeast is a combination of sea level rise that's already happened. So what you saw with Sandy was existing sea level rise combined with increased frequency of storms, leading to storm surge, which is really what caused all the damage in Sandy, $66 billion in damage. You're going to see increased sea level rise in the Northeast. And what's interesting about sea level rise is that it isn't the same everywhere. A lot of people think of sea level rise as like a cup that you pour water into and it's equal across the top. Actually, because of a lot of factors, tectonic plate shifts, distance from the ice caps, it's very different depending on where you are. So for instance, New York City sea level rise is projected to be higher than Portland, Maine, because of some of those impacts. So you're going to see sea level rise, but then that storm surge with the increased hurricane activity is really what gets you in the Northeast. And the big issue with the Northeast is, of course, a lot of very valuable infrastructure and real estate is right there on the coast. Something like 78% or 80% of everybody living in the Northeast lives in coastal counties. So, and a lot of the GDP of that region comes from coastal counties. So it's a very significant impact when you see that kind of flooding.
So what are we doing about it? Well, we have another one of your graphics going up on our screen now. This shows sort of business as usual, our current path. That's the red, that's the trajectory we're on, compared to some of the others where it either slows down or in the green line, the only one that actually bends down, large emission reductions measuring CO2 output. So what is this, reality versus wishful thinking, or how should we view this graphic?
Well, I would say, in some ways, I know it doesn't seem optimistic, but I'm sort of optimistic. I mean, we do these risk assessments in business all the time on things that seem dire and apocalyptic. So war and terrorism are done, we look at through risk assessment. For instance, businesses do extreme weather events, other economic events. What risk assessment is a way to translate longer term potential impacts into action today. So what we're really trying to say with the report is, look, we gave you at a very granular level all of these potential risks and costs on the path we're on now, but we don't have to stay on that path. So there's a number of things you can do. You can bend that curve down, obviously through dramatic reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, and that's a big step that the national government needs to take, but also through investments in resilience, investing in making our infrastructure lower carbon, investing in making it more resilient against some of these outcomes. Some of the stuff we modeled is already in the system. So that sea level rise in New York that led to Sandy, that's already there. That's based on business decisions we made 40, 50 years ago. So today's decisions will affect what that curve looks like 40 or 50 years from now. It is an issue for today. It is not an issue for tomorrow.
And what you're really describing, I think, in part, is a big difference in who did this study. So we're used to hearing studies with projections on global warming from environmental groups or from neutral climate scientists in the scientific sector, or Al Gore in An Inconvenient Truth, who also used a lot of striking graphics. This came, you're telling us, from the risk assessors within corporate America. So I'm curious if you already see the results in terms of changed thinking, because I think the corporate impulse is generally not to support carbon taxes or whatever government solutions there might be to global warming prevention, because they're afraid it's going to drag down the economy, which is going to hurt the bottom line. If this is going to hurt the bottom line, if doing nothing is going to hurt the bottom line, then are they talking about this differently in the boardrooms as a result of your report or any other similar ones?
Well, it's a great question. There has been some really good work done before this report by Ceres, which is a great organization out of Boston, and others that have looked at insurance companies in particular, but also sort of looked at the risk from climate change. And there has been some movement. Ceres put out a report fairly recently showing that something like 40 or 50% of the big Fortune 100 companies are starting to look at climate risk. My experience and our experience has been that the companies that look at this tend to be one of two things, that look at it seriously and take a public position on it. One, companies that are designing low carbon technologies. I mean, the obvious self-interest, right? So clean tech companies that are designing the solutions are very public about these issues. Then consumer-facing companies like Nike and Apple and others whose customers really care about climate change have been pretty public about it. What we don't see is an incorporation of climate risk into mainstream business, and particularly those businesses making these long-term capital investments. So bond raters, bond issuers for cities. The agricultural sector has been pretty good actually on adaptation. I would say they're ahead of the game. But utilities are just starting to take this seriously. Con Edison was just forced into taking a position on climate by a lawsuit. So what we want to see is this becoming a mainstream business issue, not a sort of consumer-facing sustainability director issue. And I think it's too early to tell. We just released the report last week. We're following it up with a lot of one-on-one conversation with CEOs and business leaders to try to get this into the mainstream conversation with those exact principles you mentioned. We have a very bipartisan group with some strong business backgrounds, and that's what we're going to do with the report.
And I've been talking about a whole other risk assessment that comes from the business community for years, and that is the insurance companies, because they're in the job of assessing economic risk to them from all of these kinds of impacts.
Yep.
And you know, they've been talking the talk for years and seeing if businesses start to walk the walk. Before you go, our segment before you was with some leaders of the divestment movement who want people to divest in fossil fuel stocks. I wonder how that looks to you from kind of within the business community. Does that look something like something that's counterproductive, or can that work for you, you know, morally, ethically, practically, even from a generally pro-business standpoint?
I think it's a great movement. It's been amazing to watch their success. It's a very different strategy. Our entire Risky Business project and the report that we just put out are really aimed pretty narrowly at a business and financial sector audience. We want to get business sector change to in turn influence the public policy conversation. The divestment conversation is frankly much more of a youth organizing campaign, and it's really good. It's very effective for that. But if you actually look at the results from it, the individual universities do invest in fossil fuels, not at a level which will kind of be a bottom line issue for a lot of those companies. On the other hand, it's a very, very good way to get students involved in the issue. So I say hats off to them. It's a different strategy, but it's very impressive.
Kate Gordon, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Disagreement and dysfunction have kept the federal government from leaping forward on climate and energy policy, but the states are taking their own small steps with a patchwork of experiments for cleaner energy. Now, New York is considering something that hasn't been done elsewhere, looking into decentralizing the power grid, giving small-scale generators, such as wind and solar, a bigger role in contributing power. The major utilities, like Con Ed and National Grid, would buy the energy from these mini generators and act like traffic cops, directing the flow of electricity. Is this a sign that the big smoke-billowing power plant is headed for extinction? Here with some answers, Richard Coffman, the Chair of Energy and Finance at the State Energy Research and Development Authority, NYSERDA, or in short, New York's first energy czar. Welcome to our program.
Thanks, Brian.
What's wrong with the system the way it exists?
Well, the system has worked very well for over 100 years. It kind of works well until it doesn't, and we saw that in terms of Sandy. The problem is it's not really sustainable, both environmentally. It's also not sustainable economically, because what's happened is that while wholesale power costs have declined because of natural gas, the costs of actually delivering electricity have continued to increase. It's a little bit like college tuition, it kind of goes up every year. And so what it means is that in New York State, we have one of the highest bills for electricity in the country. And so it's not sustainable economically. In the last 10 years, we invested $10 billion in the infrastructure, electricity infrastructure in the state. In the next 10 years, if we don't do anything differently, it's going to be $17 billion. So that's economically not sustainable. And in addition, while the cost of what's called central station power and distribution, which is the system we know, the cost of distributed solutions, whether it's solar or fuel cells or batteries, all that stuff continues to decline.
So how does decentralizing actually help? Are we talking about gigantic wind farms in the ocean off, Long Island, or what are we talking about?
We need to have a network system because the electricity system was designed at a time when the technology was different, and so it was a central station, hub and spoke system where the electrons flowed one way. And we need a system now which is a system where it's a more robust and network system, and that's a system that's going to give customers more value for their electricity system.
How does that relate to climate change?
Well, it relates to climate change because it can be a more efficient system.
Wind and solar are not scalable yet at as affordable a price as conventional fuels, are they?
Well, so the question there relates to the tremendous cost we're already incurring in our electricity system. So we are incurring the cost of a lot of capital in the system that is hardly ever used. So if you think about the electricity system as a series of pipes, the capital that's deployed has to be able to accommodate the hottest days of the year. But it means that the total capacity utilization of the system, how much is actually used on average, is only about 57%. And all that cost of capital has to be borne by ratepayers every day of the year. So part of what we're trying to do is to create price signals to focus on where distributed solutions of all sorts can help the grid and reduce the capital intensity of the system.
Who'll be building these small stations, and where would they go?
Well, New York, you could say, has the benefit of lots of areas which are constrained. So in Brooklyn, for example, there's tremendous growth in demand, particularly for air conditioning. And so if we do things as business as usual, Con Ed will have to invest $2 billion for new infrastructure. And so if we can find distributed solutions, that's going to be better for all ratepayers.
Bill McKibben earlier mentioned that Germany is generating 75, and I'm trying to remember the exact stat so I don't overstate it, but it was 75% of its energy from solar on some days.
Right.
Is there a model there in terms of distribution that New York can learn from?
Yes. I mean, Germany is a very interesting case, and it's both a positive case and a negative case. It's a positive case because it shows you that it is possible to deploy a tremendous amount of renewable energy within a short period of time. The negative case about Germany is that they have some operating issues because they have essentially coal power plants that are turning on and off. And the other thing that's happened is that the cost of electricity is high for many customers, and the utilities have lost 2/3 of their economic value. And so we want to try to take advantage of the lessons of Germany and to have a system which is market-based, which is going to be both pro-growth, pro-environment, and will also save customers money.
Do we need incentives on the part of the state of New York, like tax incentives? For example, New Jersey has been a leader in the country in terms of solar energy conversion at homes and at businesses because there was a state tax credit. Governor Christie, I think, is trying to work against that because he doesn't think the state should keep subsidizing this if it's not taking off on its own. But is that a model for New York?
Well, we do provide support for renewable energy and energy efficiency, and I think this is an example where the states also have to evolve in their policy, and we have to evolve because the federal government is not acting, and we have to also evolve because the support programs have gotten the industry to a certain point, but we need to really engage markets because government does not have enough money to lead to the transformation of the energy system.
So how do we engage markets?
So I think we engage markets by changing some regulatory incentives, and in terms of the support programs, we shouldn't be funding a project here or a project there. So one of the things that's been very interesting after Sandy is many communities want to take control over their energy system. And so that's an example when you get a community, say, interested in solar. The benefit of that kind of community interest is that the cost of solar goes down. And the reason why it goes down is because you have the benefit of group buying. It also goes down because the installation costs go down because you have a critical mass. And it can also go down through the regulatory changes that I described, because if it happens to be in a grid-constrained area, all that solar is going to help the grid.
So will the Con Eds of the world fight this, or will they go along with decentralization? Do they have a horse in this?
Well, I think that the utility industry generally is well aware that, that there needs to be change in their industry, and there are probably more than 40 different confabs going on around the country of the utility of the future.
Because they have sort of monopoly distribution rights anyway, right? So where they get their, I'm guessing, but where they get their energy maybe wouldn't matter so much to them?
Well, in New York State, the distribution utilities are only that. They only provide distribution. They don't own their own power plants.
Where does natural gas come in?
Natural gas comes in that it provides an opportunity also for enhancement of distributed generation. So we think about solar as a distributed energy resource, but it also provides the power for a local power plant that could be done at a building level, what's called combined heat and power, or fuel cells also use natural gas, which is something that can be done at the local level. There's a utility in New Jersey, NRG, that's has a technology that they want to introduce that would actually have, just in the same way that you have a furnace in your house, a small little power plant that would allow you to actually disconnect from the utility.
And in terms of price, is this the equivalent in a way of Ma Bell once upon a time, which was broken up as sort of the telephone service monopoly? You know, now there's a gazillion companies that sell us phone service, and we still pay a lot for phone service because we want all the bells and whistles on our cell phones. But is this kind of like that, and there'll be more competition for price?
Well, there'll be more competition for price and more competition generally for value. And I think that the telecom example is a very important one because the technology changed. So it's true, we pay less for a phone call, but we pay more for other things, and that's because we get more value out of the system. And I think we're really at that same kind of point again today in the electricity system. When Edison helped invent the electricity system, he thought it was just going to be about lighting. And we're kind of at that point again today because obviously electricity turned out to be a lot more than just lighting. We're at the point today where the new electricity system, which relates to things that are distributed, can provide a whole range of things that could be about comfort or health or convenience. And so it may be that the drivers for change in the electricity system aren't climate change, but other things, and people may wind up doing the right thing, as it were, for the wrong reasons.
Richard Coffman, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Up next, as our special on climate change concludes, the politics of pollution in China, which burns half the world's coal. Here's where economics, politics, and pollution get really complicated. China, the rapidly developing nation, is the world's largest emitter of carbon. It accounts for half the world's coal consumption and emits a third of all greenhouse gases. On the ground, this materializes as everyday pollution, which people see and smell and breathe. A recent World Health Organization report found almost half of all 7 million pollution deaths in 2012 occurred in China. Beijing has issued some new regulations, but, says our next guest, the complex political environment across the Chinese landscape makes change difficult. Joining us via Skype, Alex Wong. He is Assistant Professor of Law at the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA. Mr. Wong is the former director of the China Environmental Law and Governance Project in Beijing for the Natural Resources Defense Council. His op-ed with co-author Benjamin Van Roy, titled China's Pollution Challenge, appeared in the New York Times in May. Hello from New York. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hello, Brian. Thank you for having me.
First of all, I was in China about a year and a half ago, in Beijing and Shanghai mostly, and I was really struck by ordinary, young, healthy-looking people walking down the street with masks on. So the kind of pollution that they're trying to protect themselves from on a daily basis, that kind of smog, is that the same thing that's affecting the climate? Because I think here we tend to think of them as different, that the climate change is kind of magical, invisible, carbon emissions. In China, is it more of the same thing?
Right. So what you're seeing visibly with the smog in China is a large portion of it comes from the burning of coal. So the coal is producing traditional air pollution, plus it is creating a lot of carbon emissions. So in China, what you're visibly seeing, a lot of it's one and the same.
Is it true that coal plants are going up every week in China? And
So
will it slow down?
Yeah, the figures that I've seen in the past, it's been 2 coal plants on average a week. China's appetite and need for power is tremendous now. In the last few years, as pollution's gotten worse and as policy has tried to increase the amount of cleaner energy in the mix, there's been some pressure to reduce the rate of this growth, but right now, China's economy is still growing quite quickly, and so they are still building power plants, although I think the rate may be slowing down a little bit.
And it must be a terrible conflict, even global warming aside, for the Chinese people. If this smog problem is so prevalent and people are choking on the air and they hate it, at the same time that the country is growing so fast economically and they need so much power because there's this growing middle class and they want to consume, they want to go in this direction and yet they want to not go in this direction. How do they square that in China?
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, I think one thing we need to remember that, China, if you look at China 40 years ago, it was a tremendously poor country. And they've had an explicit policy to have rapid economic growth, and it's led to the economic miracle we've seen in China. And the result of it, on the flip side, is that it's created a tremendous pollution problem. And that pollution problem has, in particular in the last 10 years or so, 10 or 15 years or so, has gotten much worse as the increase in steel plants, cement plants, a lot of other heavy industry has increased. And I think particularly in the last 2 or 3 years, it's gotten to a level where it's really sort of on a daily basis affecting the very way people live. When you wake up in the morning, you see fog, smog as thick as a San Francisco fog, and it really affects every facet of people's lives. What you mentioned earlier about the face masks is something relatively new in the last 3 or 4 years. In the past, people didn't do that, and it wasn't sort of a top of mind issue. So people were happy about the economic growth and sort of tolerating the environmental problems. But these days, I think the pollution problems have gotten to a point that's really quite intolerable.
So what are these new laws? What are the legal issues?
Well, China just amended its environmental protection law for the first time in a few decades, and it reflects a number of efforts to strengthen enforcement. So in China, the problem has long been that there's a fairly complex set of laws on the books, but enforcement has always been notoriously poor. And so, for example, the law that they just amended has increased the ability of regulators to fine. So it's things that are very simple, like allowing fines per day of violation. It used to be that if a factory violated the law for 100 days or 1 day, there would be a max fine that would apply to that violation. These days, if you continue to violate for 10 days, 20 days, the fines compound. So it's a simple logic that they're giving more ability for the regulators to fine. And I think the most important amendment recently is explicit emphasis on the right of the public to participate in environmental regulation and to get access to information about pollution, and to in the law it refers to public supervision of polluters. And so I think that's a really important aspect of the legal amendment.
When you're talking about public participation, I think Americans have an image of China as a totally authoritarian country where no demonstrations are allowed. We think of Tiananmen Square, and that's where we stop our thinking. But my understanding is that there are literally tens of thousands of demonstrations that take place in China every year, and that more of them are about local environmental issues, pollution, than anything else. Is that accurate?
Right. So I think the politics of this are extremely complex. So I think it's surprising to a lot of people that official policy might be encouraging public supervision, right? So I think in part your question gets at part of the reason why this is the case. Even before the law allowed for it, people were in fact, quote unquote, participating by taking to the streets in many small cities and villages around the country when a given lead smelter or a coal-fired power plant just emitted so much pollution that life became intolerable in those places. And so I think that the authorities know that people are very attuned to this issue and care a great deal about it. And I think the idea is that people are getting involved in this issue anyway. Let's try to channel it in a way that's more productive and sort of in line with government policy as well.
And what about groups like yours, NRDC? We know NRDC in this country, mainstream environmental group. Is there such a thing as an environmental group in China? So
there are tens of thousands of environmental groups in China. Most of those are literally a person or two, so very small. If you're talking about groups that have any sort of capacity to do advocacy in an organized way, you're really talking about 10, 20, maybe a few dozen groups around the country. But these groups are getting more capable. They're tapping into international networks. They're becoming better funded, and I think they are part of China's great hope for resolving the environmental problem.
And we just have 30 seconds left. Given all that we've talked about, how do you see China's role at the upcoming climate summit in late September in New York?
So I think there's going to be tremendous pressure on China. They are going to account for about half of the expected growth in emissions in the next few decades. And with the U.S. beginning to move more affirmatively to pass regulations on carbon emissions, it's going to put a lot of pressure on China. And so we'll see what happens. It's always hard to predict these things, but I think China will have to do even more than it has been doing.
So maybe more movement than we have seen from China and the U.S. at that summit coming in New York. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And that's our special on climate change. If you missed any portion, find this and all our programs at CUNY.tv. We're here every week at this hour, and tune into my daily radio program weekday mornings at 10 on WNYC, 93.9 FM, and AM 820. I'm Brian Lehrer. Thanks for watching.